The true origin of the American Civil War, what historians get wrong. Here's something that might surprise you. If you went to public school almost anywhere in the American South for most of the 20th century, there's a real chance you were taught that the Civil War was primarily fought over states' rights, a noble constitutional disagreement with slavery as a secondary issue at most. That version of events was taught in millions of classrooms, defended in official Confederate memorial pamphlets, and enforced by textbook review boards for the better part of 100 years. Here's the thing, the actual leaders of the Confederacy never described it that way. Not once, not vaguely, not in passing. For states wrote formal declarations explaining exactly why they were seceding, and each one named slavery as the central cause, often in the very first paragraph. This is the story of how a war fought overwhelmingly over slavery got quietly rewritten, within a single generation, into a story about something else entirely, and how it took historians the better part of a century to correct the record. To understand what actually caused the Civil War, you have to go back to the fundamental compromise baked into the country at its founding. The Constitution never resolved the question of slavery, it postponed it. Delegates at the 1787 Constitutional Convention negotiated a series of explicit compromises to hold slaveholding and non-slaveholding states together in a single union, the Three-Fifths Compromise, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation and taxation, a clause protecting the international slave trade from federal interference until at least 1808, and a fugitive slave clause obligating states to return escaped enslaved people to their owners. These weren't afterthoughts. They were the price of getting Southern delegates to sign on to the Constitution at all. For decades, the country managed this fundamental tension through a series of geographic compromises, each one an attempt to preserve a rough political balance between free and slave states as the country expanded westward. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state simultaneously, while drawing a line across the remaining Louisiana territory north of which slavery would be prohibited. It worked in the narrow sense that it held the Union together for another generation, but it also revealed, starkly, that the country's political leadership understood slavery's westward expansion as the single issue capable of tearing the nation apart, serious enough to require an elaborately engineered numerical balance in Congress just to keep the peace. Now, what does this mean in practice for the ordinary conditions of the time? By the 1850s, slavery wasn't a marginal institution confined to a few plantations, it was the economic foundation of the entire South. Cotton, picked and processed almost entirely by enslaved labor, had become the United States' single largest export by value. Mississippi alone, by the eve of secession, was producing roughly 1.2 million bales of cotton a year, virtually all of it dependent on enslaved labor, and the state's convention would later describe its economic position as, in essence, thoroughly bound up with the institution of slavery itself. Enslaved people represented not just a labor force but an enormous store of wealth. By some estimates, the monetary value of enslaved people in the United States on the eve of the war exceeded the combined value of the nation's railroads and factories. This wasn't a system that Southern political and economic elites regarded as a peripheral issue to be traded away. It was, in the most literal financial sense, the thing their entire regional economy was built on. Through the 1850s, the fragile geographic compromises that had held the country together for decades began collapsing one after another, and each collapse pushed the country closer to war. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise's geographic line by letting settlers in the new Kansas and Nebraska territories decide the slavery question for themselves through a principle called popular sovereignty. The result was not democracy working smoothly, it was armed conflict. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas specifically to influence the vote, and the territory descended into several years of guerrilla violence, arson, and killings that came to be known, grimly, as Bleeding Kansas. Rival territorial governments formed, each claiming legitimacy. A pro-slavery mob sacked the Free State town of Lawrence in May 1856, and within days, the abolitionist John Brown led a retaliatory raid that killed 5 pro-slavery settlers along Pottawatomie Creek. Slavery, in other words, had stopped being an abstract political disagreement in Washington and had become a literal shooting war on the American frontier years before Fort Sumter. Then came the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in March 1857, which took an already volatile situation and made it worse. Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had sued for his freedom on the grounds that his owner had taken him to live in free territory, lost his case in a ruling that went far beyond the narrow facts in front of the court. Chief Justice Roger Taney's majority opinion held that Black Americans, enslaved or free, could never be citizens of the United States, and further ruled that Congress had no constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in the federal territories at all, effectively declaring the entire compromise framework that had held the country together since 1820 unconstitutional from the start. For opponents of slavery's expansion, the ruling was a genuine political catastrophe. The nation's highest court had just removed the primary legal tool available for containing slavery's spread, and had done so in language many read as denying Black Americans any claim to citizenship or rights whatsoever. Picture the scene at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, on the night of October 16, 1859. John Brown, the same man responsible for the Potawatomi killings 3 years earlier, leading a small armed band of roughly 20 men, black and white, including several of his own sons, in a raid on the federal armory there, intending to seize its weapons and arm an uprising of enslaved people across the South. The raiders moved in darkness, cutting telegraph lines, seizing hostages, and briefly holding the armory before local militia and, eventually, a detachment of U.S. Marines commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee surrounded the building and stormed it. 10 of Brown's men were killed in the fighting, including 2 of his sons. Brown himself was captured, tried for treason against the state of Virginia, and hanged on December 2, 1859. In the North, prominent abolitionists including Ralph Waldo Emerson praised Brown's conviction and moral seriousness even while distancing themselves from his methods. Church bells tolled in some northern towns on the day of his execution. In the South, the raid confirmed a deep and growing fear that Northern abolitionists were actively plotting armed insurrection among the enslaved population. A fear that hardened Southern political opinion and pushed moderate voices in the region toward secessionist sentiment far faster than they might otherwise have moved. By 1860, the country's political system had essentially split along this single axis. The Democratic Party, the last major institution still holding together a genuine national coalition of Northern and Southern voters, fractured that year into competing Northern and Southern factions, unable to agree on a single platform regarding slavery's expansion. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency that November with a platform explicitly opposing slavery's expansion into new territories, without carrying a single Southern state, and without his name even appearing on the ballot in most of the Deep South. To Southern political leaders, Lincoln's election, achieved entirely on Northern votes, was proof that the free states now held enough combined political power to eventually restrict and, they feared, ultimately abolish slavery nationwide, with or without Southern consent. Here's the thing, this is exactly the moment where the popular states' rights explanation runs directly into the actual documentary record, and the record is remarkably explicit. South Carolina seceded first on December 20, 1860, and its formal secession declaration didn't describe an abstract constitutional grievance. It described, specifically, growing hostility in the northern states toward the institution of slavery, and named Lincoln directly as a man whose opinions and purposes were hostile to slavery. Mississippi followed on January 9, 1861, and its declaration was, if anything, even more direct, stating plainly that the state's position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, describing it as the greatest material interest in the world. Georgia and Texas issued similarly explicit declarations naming slavery as the central and immediate cause of secession. These weren't private letters or off-the-cuff remarks by minor officials. They were the official, formally adopted public explanations these state governments gave the world for why they were leaving the Union, written and ratified by the same conventions that voted to secede. If the documentary record from 1860 and 1861 is this explicit, the obvious question is, how did an entire regional culture, and eventually much of the national memory of the war, end up believing something so different? The answer is a deliberate, decades-long campaign, and it has real names, real organizations, and a real, traceable timeline. The effort began almost immediately after the war ended, led in its earliest years by former Confederate General Jubal Early, who helped found the Southern Historical Society in New Orleans in 1869, and later relocated its operations to Richmond. Early and a circle of former Confederate officers spent the 1870s and 1880s writing histories, memoirs, and articles that recast the Confederacy's cause in far more sympathetic and far less slavery-centered terms, work that historians today generally identify as the earliest organized version of what came to be called the Lost Cause narrative. Vice President Alexander Stephens himself became part of this shift. the same man who had stood before an audience in Savannah in March 1861 and declared in his cornerstone speech that the Confederacy's new government rested on the foundational truth of black racial inferiority and the naturalness of slavery, later wrote a post-war memoir insisting the war had actually been fought over constitutional principles and states' rights, retroactively downplaying the very words he had spoken as the Confederacy's sitting vice president. The truly decisive turn from private nostalgia into large-scale public education came with the founding of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in Nashville in September 1894. The organization, formed primarily by Southern white women descended from Confederate veterans, launched what amounted to a sustained, decades-long campaign to control how the war was taught in Southern schools. In 1919, the organization's general historian, Mildred Lewis Rutherford, produced a pamphlet with an unambiguous title, A Measuring Rod to Test Textbooks and Reference Books in Schools, Colleges, and Libraries. It laid out specific criteria for judging whether a textbook was acceptable, explicitly rejecting any book that failed to frame secession around constitutional grievances and states' rights, or that described slavery as central to the Confederate cause, or that characterized slavery itself as a cruel institution rather than a broadly benevolent one. By the early 20th century, the United Daughters of the Confederacy and allied veterans organizations had gained enough influence over Southern textbook selection committees that publishers seeking to sell books in the region had strong commercial incentive to conform to lost cause framing, regardless of the actual historical record. This campaign didn't stay confined to Southern classrooms. It received major academic reinforcement from historian William A. Dunning of Columbia University, whose highly influential early 20th century school of Reconstruction historiography, now generally referred to as the Dunning School, portrayed the Reconstruction era following the war as a period of corrupt misrule imposed on the defeated South, implicitly reinforcing the broader lost cause framing that Confederate resistance had been principled rather than a defense of slavery. The lost cause narrative reached its widest popular audience through culture rather than scholarship. D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, adapted from a novel glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, portrayed Reconstruction-era black political power as a grave injustice and the Klan's violent suppression of it as heroic. The film became one of the most commercially successful of the silent era, and was reportedly the first film screened inside the White House. Margaret Mitchell's 1936 novel, Gone with the Wind, and its blockbuster 1939 film adaptation presented an idealized image of the antebellum South, and its enslaved population that reached tens of millions of Americans who would likely never read a single academic history of the period. The scholarly correction to all of this took decades to fully take hold, and it's worth naming the historian most responsible for bringing the corrected account to a mass popular audience rather than confining it to academic journals. James M. McPherson, a historian trained at Johns Hopkins University under the mentorship of C. Van Woodward, published Battle Cry of Freedom, The Civil War Era in February 1988, a single-volume, nearly 900-page history of the war's causes and course that treated slavery, without qualification or euphemism, as the central issue driving the nation to war. The book won the Pulitzer Prize in 1989, sold more than 600,000 copies, and is widely credited with helping spark a broader public renaissance of serious interest in accurate Civil War history, reinforced soon afterward by Ken Burns's popular 1990 documentary series. McPherson's work joined a broader wave of professional Civil War historiography through the late 20th century that returned again and again to the same conclusion the participants themselves had stated plainly in 1861. That slavery, not an abstract disagreement over states' rights, was the cause the war's own architects had named at the time, before decades of post-war myth-making obscured it. There wasn't a single law or court decision that formally corrected the historical record the way legislation might resolve a policy dispute. This was a shift in scholarly and public consensus, built gradually over decades of archival research, primary source analysis, and public history work, rather than a single decisive reform. But the shift has been real and substantial. Professional historians today overwhelmingly identify slavery, and specifically the political conflict over its expansion into new Western territories, as the central and precipitating cause of secession and the war that followed, a conclusion drawn directly from the same primary documents, secession declarations, the cornerstone speech, the Confederate Constitution's own explicit protections for slaveholding, that lost cause historians and organizations spent generations working to obscure or reframe. But being honest about what this correction did and didn't accomplish matters here too. The lost cause narrative was never simply erased from American public memory the moment McPherson's book won its Pulitzer Prize. It persisted, and in some places still persists, in monuments, place names, popular assumptions, and educational materials produced well after professional historical consensus had already moved on. Confederate monuments erected specifically during the peak years of Lost Cause and Jim Crow-era activism, roughly the 1900s through the 1920s and again during the mid-20th century civil rights era, remained standing in public spaces across the South for generations after the historical claims they commemorated had been thoroughly documented as inaccurate by professional historiography. Nor is the correction itself free of remaining debate. Serious historians continue to argue over secondary questions: the relative weight of economic versus purely ideological motivations, how much ordinary Confederate soldiers who owned no enslaved people themselves understood or cared about the cause, the degree to which Northern war aims initially centered on preserving the Union rather than ending slavery outright. These are legitimate, ongoing scholarly conversations. What is not seriously contested among professional historians today is the war's fundamental cause, precisely because the participants who started it left behind such an explicit and voluminous record of their own stated reasons. This isn't ancient history. Confederate monuments debated and, in some cases, removed within the last decade were often erected not by Civil War veterans themselves in the 1860s, but by their grandchildren's generation decades later. During the same era, the United Daughters of the Confederacy was actively rewriting textbooks, meaning many of the physical markers of lost cause memory that still stand today are themselves artifacts of the myth-making campaign this story describes, not of the war itself. Millions of Americans alive today were taught some version of the states' rights framing in school, particularly if they were educated in the South before the historiographical shift McPherson's generation helped popularize had fully worked its way into public school curricula. This is a story that unfolded within the lifetimes of people whose grandchildren are alive today, not a settled matter from some distant, unreachable past. The underlying pattern this story reveals, that the losing side of a conflict or the side whose stated motivations become retrospectively unpopular, can shape how that conflict gets remembered for generations, sometimes more successfully than the side that documented its actual reasons at the time, is not unique to the Civil War. It raises a genuinely open question that extends well beyond this one historical episode. How much of what any of us understand as settled history was actually shaped, quietly and gradually, by whoever had the greater institutional patience and organizational reach to control classrooms, monuments, and popular culture in the decades immediately following the events themselves? And what does it take, as a society, to correct a historical record once a mistaken version has already been taught to multiple generations as simple, uncontested fact? If this story changed the way you think about the version of the Civil War you were taught, hit subscribe or drop a like. We go deep on hidden systems, power, and the forgotten machinery of how history gets remembered. Stories most people never think about until the day they suddenly need to. I'll see you in the next one.